My story begins with a man who's been very influential in my life, but he's a man that I've never met. It begins with a grandparent who died before I was born. This grandparent, Grandpa Buzz. Now, at the time this picture was taken, my father's family and Grandpa Buzz were living in Moab, Utah, back before it was an outdoor mecca, before Arches was a national park, and when it was just a bunch of miners and ranchers trying to scrape a living out of the desert. Now, at the time, my grandpa and his family were doing pretty well at scraping this living, so they decided that they would build their first family home. And my father, being the oldest, helped my grandfather the most in this construction. So over a few years in the 1960s, my father and his father built a home. But they also built the relationship between a father and a son. And this experience is something that my father has always wanted to share with me, pictured in the background, not looking at the camera. Now, my father's gotten a few years older since that picture was taken, and he's once again in the background. And in case you can't tell, I'm the angsty adolescent not looking at the camera up in front. And in our research for how we would build this house, we came across an idea that's not revolutionary or novel, but in its applications can be fundamentally important for how human habitats will change in the future. And so this idea starts with pretty simple origins. It starts with these. Each year, thousands of metal shipping containers make their way across the oceans to the United States. But because we import more than we export, many of these containers pile up in metal mounds like these, staying empty and not being utilized. These containers stack on top of each other like building blocks, like the Legos we used to play with as children, where if you were a patient child, like I was, you would get your latest kit of Legos and pull out the instructions and follow step by step, brick by brick, how to build your little castle or your Millennium Falcon. But the best experiences that we had when we were playing with Legos didn't come from following the instructions. It was when we used our imaginations to design our own castles, to design our own spaceships out of this pile of different shaped bricks, that we truly gained experience as children. And by applying this imagination and looking at these shipping containers, we can see how we could take these empty containers that aren't being used and make something useful out of them, like a home. Or we could take these containers and stack them one on top of the other and make them into an office building, like this one's shown. So what we're doing is we're taking structures that already exist but aren't being utilized, and with a little creativity, we're modifying them and adapting them and evolving them to be used in functional structures and functional habitats, in buildings. And this idea isn't novel in any way. It's basically recycling. It's being thrifty with a resource and a structure that we already have and making it into something useful. And this idea can be important for humans as we continue to expand and to move on into the next frontiers. And if you were to ask someone at the Seasteading Institute in San Francisco, California, where these next frontiers for humanity would be, they would tell you that they're going to take place in communities like this. To seastead is to homestead on the sea. It's to colonize the oceans. The oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface, but humans have barely made a scratch on this entire area. at the Seasteading Institute, they believe that we can build structures on the oceans like these that will allow us to take advantage of the natural resources inherent in the oceans, that we can work to solve world hunger and our dependence on fossil fuels by growing algae near to these seasteading structures that can then be processed into foods or processed into biofuels. They believe that these communities will be technological hotbeds where people will be pushing the frontiers of what's possible. They believe that these communities will be the perfect places to experiment with new forms of human governance, to experiment with how we organize in societies as humans. And if these communities are indeed going to be the next frontiers, we should try to consider how we can build these communities with the resources that we already have. Something like this: a cargo ship that's designed to survive on the ocean for decades. Unfortunately, what happens with most of these cargo ships when they're retired is they'll be stripped of all of the valuable components and innards and left to rust out in ship graveyards like this one shown off the coast of Mauritania. These ships are left to decay in these spots and to pollute the oceans. But instead of allowing this to happen, we can take advantage of these structures. We can modify them and utilize them to be part of these future seasteading communities in the next 30 or 40 years. Consider a cruise ship. It's designed to support thousands of humans for up to a week on end. And with a little modification and with connecting them to larger structures out in the ocean, these could form the future living spaces of people on the seasteading communities. So instead of just allowing this to rust away, we can modify them and adapt them for our future habitats. And so, if we're going to consider these oceans as being the next frontier, we must also consider the final frontier: space. The company Bigelow Aerospace is at the cutting edge of the design of future space habitats. And these habitats are powerful because of the structures that they're made of and how the walls are made. The walls are composed of a fabric that's stronger than Kevlar. And so this allows the individual modules to be compressed down into little cylinders that can then be launched into space. And when they eventually reach orbit, can then be pressurized and expanded so we can get much more volume per each individual capsule, per each individual rocket that we send up. So these individual modules can then be linked together to create the next generation of space stations, the next generation of space habitats. These modules can also be used to put bases on the moon or on Mars. And the fabrics, like I said, have a material in them stronger than Kevlar that allows them to withstand micrometeorite impacts and the other inherent dangers of living in space. Now, scientists have also recently discovered another material that is stronger than Kevlar, and it comes from this. This is nanocellulose, and it can be stretched out into individual filaments that can then be implanted into plastic sheets that will then be stronger than Kevlar. And so theoretically, with more testing, these sheets might be able to withstand the austere environment of space. They might be able to withstand the micrometeorite impacts and the radiation that will be inherent in this environment. And then these sheets could be used to create future space stations. And what's so beautiful about nanocellulose is that it can be created from leftover organic material. It's created from wood pulp. So we could take the wood pulp left over from a wood processing factory and process this pulp in turn to create nanocellulose fibers that can make up future space stations, future space habitats that we might establish in the next 60 to 70 years. So where do we stand right now? This is a picture of the Atlantic coast from from the International Space Station. And if you look up here, this is Cleveland, this is Columbus. So right around here is Delaware, Ohio. Right around here is Sanborn Music Hall. Right around here is the Jemison Auditorium, where I'm standing right now. If we look to the past, we can see that humans have always sought to explore, to expand their civilizations. But as we now look at the present, we see that we need to make use of the limited resources that we have in an effective way. And we need to protect our environment and protect our planet if we'll continue to survive as a civilization. And so as we move into the future, this idea of expanding our civilizations while protecting the environments might not have to be so mutually exclusive if we can make use of the resources that we have to build the next generation of habitats on land, on sea, and in space. Thank you.